Uh, okay, so where my brain is right now is on this subject of experiences in STM ministry. And I just did one where I started talking about patterns, and so a couple more things came to mind so I'll make a second video on the patterns. Um, but in terms of my notes, I want to start that with there's a pattern of this being very hard to explain to a church. One of the more challenging things for me has been if a church is thinking of bringing me in as an STM, and then they ask me to explain what what I'm going to do, and and because in some ways, right, you can't be honest. First of all, you can't be honest because you don't know exactly what's going to happen. But secondly, if you come in there saying, yeah, there's a good possibility everything's going to change, or you're going to gain insights that'll rock your world, or things like that. The chances may diminish of you actually being invited to come there. So I've learned a couple of things, and I'll tell this story. Um, so there was a church that I interviewed with on one of these, like this is before COVID and Zoom and all that. Um, these intercom phone things where there's 12 people in a council room at the church, and then you're on your phone wherever you are. And they were they had been mandated by classes to bring in an STM, and so they wanted to talk to me. So the chairperson opened the meeting up. It's so difficult when you can't see anybody. There were brief introductions all around the table, and he threw a couple of softball questions my way. He was, I think, Dort educated, so he could ask some. He knew how to do that, and some intelligent yet soft questions. and then and then suddenly, when he threw it open to others, there was this voice of an older man. Um, if you can imagine this, I can't reenact it. I've tried a couple of times. I actually end up closer to Sean Connery than John Wayne. But imagine John Wayne with a thick Dutch accent, rolling his R's and all that kind of stuff. And so when he threw the questions open, I heard that voice, and it went something like this: "Surely, Pastor, you would agree with me when I say a new minister should never be more than 3 years in his first church." Well, I knew already when he said, "Surely you would agree with me," that I was going to disagree with whatever he said after that. And I also knew in my gut that I needed to. And later on, I started realizing that this was a person who actually needed to, he was very insecure in his authority. And so he needed somebody to affirm him. So I disagreed. And we had a little conversation back and forth, and we kind of met in the middle. And that was it for that round. A couple other questions. The chair asked a few more questions. And then as he was trying to wrap up, this same voice came back again. And I had answered as honestly as I could about that we're going to reflect on. By then, I think I had my 4 questions framework ready. So who have you been as a church? Who are you now as a church? That means your demographic and your community. And then out of those 2 things with the transition team, we start praying about and figuring out who God might be calling us to become in the future. And then the 4th one is what kind of a pastor can help us get there. Because that 4th one is about another pattern that I see a lot, where people say the new pastor will bring us a vision. A huge mistake, not reformed thinking at all. I know any of those who've been through education with me know how much I fought church order and stuff like that, but I've learned the wisdom of that, because that's a setup. That's a setup for the pastor. If you believe you're going to come in and bring the vision, no. I focus on having the congregation establish an idea of their vision and then look for a pastor who can help them accomplish it. So I had probably laid that out, and so at the end of this, I'll pause till they start. No, I'll just keep going. At the there. So that voice comes again and says, "Pastor, it sounds like you're gonna come here and make a stink. Stir up all kinds of trouble." And I answered with this story. When I was in high school, between grade 9 and 10 and 10 and 11, I worked on a dairy farm for the summer. And I worked for some months after finishing school as well. And so I learned some things about dairy farms, and I learned about how the manure is taken out of the barn and how it piles up behind the barn. And I saw how that manure pile like greens over really nicely, and it makes what looks like a nice green, very healthy pasture. Very vital, very dark green. And but I also learned that is actually, if it's just on bare ground, it's toxic to that ground that it's sitting on, which is why a lot of people put a concrete platform down now. But that manure is no good to the farmer or to the land unless it's spread, and that stinks. There's this awkward silence. One guy later told me he knew exactly that I was saying, yes, I might likely come and raise a stink, but that it would be good for the church. But most of the others just didn't even understand this idea of answering a question with a story. So that's the job is very hard to explain, and sometimes I even think that there should be so it just has to be an intervention by God if you actually get a contract after being as honest as you can and yet as couched as you can while talking to a congregation. I'll continue this one with my next thought. Another pattern that I've seen, stronger in some areas than in others, but to some degree in almost every place I've served, is, but I'm thinking mostly of the most extreme case that I saw it as, where there's a belief that the council, and particularly the consistory, the elders, are representatives of the people to the governing board. And so I ran into it a number of times where elders would bring issues forward that people had brought to them. And almost like they were their member of parliament or their senator, kind of a thing. I have a constituent who blah, 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 this and that and that. And so I've had the opportunity a couple times, again, the irony of Pete Vanderbeek going back to church order and the way we've always done things and explaining the value of why we've done things the way we used to, but to remind them that actually the elders are the representatives of Christ back to the people. They're not complaint collectors. And often they've fallen into that role. And in one case, I saw it create extreme anxiety for an elder because he was somewhat like-minded to the people that were most anxious about what was going on with me there as an STM. And they, instead of going to their own elder, which at least is a bit healthier, would then go to him with their complaints because they knew he agreed with them. And he had difficulty communicating on top of that, and he was anxious, and so it was just agonizing to see him in that agony of being in that mistaken position. And so it was great when some of the other elders said to him, "Why is so and so talking to you? They should talk to me. I'm their elder, and I can answer their questions." So the church is not a democracy, and that is a pattern that belief that the church is a democracy is growing, it seems, in some of our churches, and it's a dangerous one. So it's important for the leadership to relearn that no, they're the decision makers. It's wise to consult the congregation, but in the end, they make the decision. They have that spiritual responsibility and authority, whether they like it or not. I just heard about a church that made a decision that was a big one. So they tried to put a super majority on it. They wanted 70%, and they got 64 or something like that. And so then it failed because they put a super majority on it. And to me, right away, I recognized that in a way, the council should have still made a decision for, because 64% on a major decision is a pretty good support. And but yeah, that actually goes to my next one. Let me see where I am. I'll do one more here, and that is called tyranny of the minority. I've seen that pattern again and again and again. Actually, I'll talk about it more when I get to anxiety in the church. But so I'll stop this one here.